Linux Luddites, episode 77, for the 2nd of May, 2016. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. Now, it's unlikely to have escaped your attention that Ubuntu have released 16.04 LTS, along with its various flavours. For this, rather than doing a deep review of one distro that everyone already knows, we thought we'd take a step back and discuss the overall Ubuntu ecosystem as it stands. And we also cover your feedback, but we won't be able to get to either of those until we've done the news. So let's crack on.
Let's start off the news then with good news for AMD, the beleaguered AMD, who weren't doing quite as well as Intel, I think it's fair to say. But they have done a new deal to license out their designs to a new Chinese company, which is made up of various public and private Chinese companies called THATIC, which is an acronym for something that I won't attempt to pronounce. And as a result of that deal, their stock has done quite well, and it seems that they might be bouncing back.
I'm actually quite surprised that AMD haven't been doing better recently, because I'm pretty sure they're the ones that won the battle to be in all the new consoles. So the PS4 is selling incredibly well and has been for, must be years now. And they all come with AMD. So it seems odd that they're not doing so well. But, I think we've talked about on the show that no one really buys AMDs for their desktops. And you kind of avoid them like the plague in laptops, don't you? So it's not surprising that they need to do something different to try and compete with Intel. And going down the sort of ARM route by allowing someone else to build them looks like what they've chosen to do.
I think it's really interesting the Chinese are going down this route, and they have in a variety of other areas as well. They're not so keen to actually offshore all of their manufacturing. They want to keep things under their control a little bit, which is completely opposite of what we in the West have done, where we've allowed other people to get on and produce things for us. And then when our economies have got into trouble, we've looked around and seen, oh, yeah, we've got loads of hairdressers and shoe shiners, and that's about it.
Yeah, but when you say we send it offshore, we send it to China. They make everything that we want, and now they're making stuff that they're going to be buying as well, because, their economy is getting bigger and people have more money.
Yeah, I think that they're not going to be wanting to offshore it to even cheaper places as they become more prosperous, though, is the point. I mean, they have had a very managed economy over the last few decades, and it's been knocking spots off the straight, supposedly capitalist economies that we have in the West.
Well, so you think that they're not going to start making things in India and places like that then?
No, they seem very keen on sort of self-sufficiency, and it does seem to be a model that will probably stand them in good stead in the long term.
So while things are going well for AMD, on the other side of the fence, Intel are hitting some troubled times, and the latest report is that they're having to cut 11% of jobs. That's 12,000 of their employees, and it's basically down to the fall in PC sales and the fact that they haven't really made any headway into the mobile market. So, a number of years ago, ARM was sort of the best low power chip, and they've really been booming, haven't they? All the mobile phones and things I own, all the tablets, have all got ARM chips in them. And so Intel kind of missed that boat, and now they're really paying the price, I think.
It's not a huge surprise, is it, given the rise of ARM? But at the same time, instead of kind of trying to compete with that, it looks like they're just going to give up and just concentrate on the server room, because the PC market's pretty much dead. And if they can't produce a low power x86 processor that can compete with ARM, then what have they got left? Big, honking great servers that can do virtualization and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they make a huge profit on those server chips. They're, they're sort of hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And that's where they can make a big markup. But there's just not that many of them to sell. And so while you don't get much of a markup on, small embedded devices, you are selling billions of them, and that's where you make your money. But Intel look like they're sort of restructuring slightly to sort of be trying to forget the fact they're basically a chip manufacturer and basically have sort of 5 pillars, they've called them. So there's cloudy things, connected things, sort of a memory business, which is mostly for servers and things, connectivity, and manufacturing. And you'll notice they've sort of dropped any sort of discussion about chips and PCs and things like this. Obviously, that will fall into, I guess, connected things as vehicles and PCs all come in there.
Yeah, it looks very much as if they're only trying to concentrate on things where they can maintain a very healthy markup, a very healthy margin on their business. As you said, they're not interested at all in sort of the mass market. Whether that's the right way to go or not, I don't know. I mean, one of the things we've seen, and we'll probably talk about a little bit later in the news, is Apple has also taken a little bit of a hit recently. And again, they're very keen on maintaining margins and staying out of the fray, basically. And as you said, Jesse, Intel just sort of said to ARM, it's your market, go for it. And whether that's sort of tenable in the long term for a manufacturer, Apple seems to be showing that it is.
I think it's a very dangerous strategy, personally, because, okay, for now, x86 processors are king in the server room because of things like virtualization, things like DigitalOcean, for example. How many droplets can they run on one huge Xeon processor? I would imagine quite a lot. But as ARM gets more and more powerful and we get more of these 64-bit ones, clusters of those could potentially offer the same performance for less electricity used, less actual power and heat and everything that goes with that. And when we get to that point, which it feels like we're nearing that point, then x86 is just out in the cold, isn't it? And Intel's business model collapses.
Well, they're clearly not interested in cannibalizing their own business, which is something we're always told sort of companies should do if they want to keep going rather than just maintain a sort of steady and slow decline. And just before we started recording, actually, it was announced that they were going to be killing off their low-powered Atom chips as well. So again, for smaller devices, sort of low-powered tablets and cheap netbooks and what have you, that's going to go away from the x86 market. And I can remember we were talking about these fairly recently with the one that was running Android and Debian, wasn't it?
Oh, was that a tablet or wasn't that a phone?
Yeah, but it was an Atom chip, wasn't it? And if they're going to be dumping those, then that sort of thing is going to disappear. And
well, yeah, I mean, that's what I found strange about the killing off of the Atom thing. What about the Internet of Things? If you're going to have an x86 chip doing any sort of low power stuff, then surely that's where Atom comes along. I mean, I know they've got their Core M series, but they are a lot more expensive. And if you're going to make things like thermostats and, all the Internet of Things stuff, you can't have really expensive chips in there, not when you can get dirt cheap ARM processor that's going to do the same job.
Well, isn't that the answer? It's going to be an ARM chip. And like you said, they're not competing with them. So maybe they're just stepping out and saying, we're going to be the back end for the Internet of Things. So they just basically focus on the cloud. And that means that everything that has to connect to an actual, sensible processor and all the work, all the heavy lifting gets done remotely, they can make their money there rather than in the actual device.
I suppose so. But what also occurred to me here is Intel have got all of this manufacturing infrastructure and experience, and they've got all the fab processing plants and all that stuff. Why don't they start making ARM chips? Why don't they license some ARM designs and start pumping those out? Would that be too much of an admission of defeat?
I suspect it would be. And certainly those of us who are old enough will remember that Intel did have a foray into RISC design chips a while back and then gave up on that. I don't know. I mean, I find the whole product line to be quite confusing these days, to be honest. I mean, there was a time when you understood what the differences between chips were and the various feature sets, and I simply don't with Intel anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you get a situation where you can have an i7 that is less powerful than an i3 because it's got a U on the end of it or whatever. They have got a very widespread, confusing lineup of products, haven't they? And it's, for me, I just have to look up the benchmarks for each individual one because the clock speed and the name of it doesn't really mean anything anymore.
Anyway, we'll just have to keep an eye on this and see how things pan out over the next few years and whether ARM just continues its relentless march onwards. Let's stick with Intel for a minute and talk about USB Type-C. Now, I was really quite enthusiastic about Type-C when it was first announced.
I wasn't.
You weren't? Why is that?
No, we don't need another standard.
You just don't want to have to change all your cables, that's all.
Yeah, exactly. I've got plenty of nice cables, thanks. But sorry, Karen, I interrupted you there, Paddy.
You did. No, it's all right. I mean, just as someone who fumbles around in the dark and invariably ends up trying to plug the thing in upside down, the idea of a reversible connector was very appealing to me. And obviously it was going to be power and data, and that seemed to make sense because that's where we're going to cut down the number of cables we have for various things. Several manufacturers have talked about pumping audio through these things in the past, which pleased you immensely, didn't it, Joe?
Oh, yes. Well, you can actually do it through standard micro USB on most phones anyway. You can have digital audio out on there, but we're moving to Type-C anyway, so I suppose that's going to be a feature of that, or is a feature of Type-C as well. And this started with Apple, didn't it? Or that certainly the rumors started with Apple that they were going to do away with the 3.5mm analog headphone jack and just replace it with yet more accessories that you have to buy from Apple to plug into their Lightning port or whatever to have digital audio. And I tweeted about this a couple of months ago, saying that the 3.5mm headphone jack is moribund. I think that was a bit of an exaggeration, but I think that we are going to move that way over the next year or two. Apple will probably bring out a phone with no headphone jack, and then their tablets won't have it either. And then the Android manufacturers will probably follow suit, I would have thought.
Well, the story I'm going to link to in the show notes is about Intel obviously pushing this, as we suggested earlier, and not just for the analog side of things, which apparently you can do over USB-C. I wasn't aware that there were a couple of pins set aside for that, but also the digital side. And that will provide opportunity for manufacturers to produce a variety of peripherals, headphones and what have you, that offer more functionality than they do currently. But also, it'll provide the manufacturers an opportunity to gouge us all, charging an awful lot more for these devices.
What do you mean by more functionality? Surely headphones and speakers and stuff just do one thing.
Well, volume controls, which I suppose you can do to some extent now, but, remotes and all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think most of our devices at the moment are purely analog, I mean, I've got some earphones in at the moment that are purely analog, and there's nothing I can do about it. The signal comes up to them and it's just produced in my ears at the moment. I can't control that signal. I can't do any sort of effects on it. Whereas if it was digital to my ear, then I could do. Of course, that would mean there's a huge, great big chunky thing plunked into my ear that I'll have paid a fortune for, but that's obviously what they want.
Oh, yeah, I get you. Things like noise cancellation and that. Okay, makes sense.
Well, it's certainly something to watch because I've been predicting it for at least a month now that we're going to have... yeah, that seriously long term I've been predicting this, that we're going to have no headphone jacks on phones going forwards. And there was one that I saw this week announced. I think it was a Chinese manufacturer, but it's going to be the standard that you won't have that headphone jack anymore, and people are going to be up in arms. Personally, I pretty much use Bluetooth all the time now, but it's nice that when my Bluetooth device thing dies, I can actually plug the headphones directly in to the phone. But I reckon for you, Paddy, it'll be about 10 years by the time you get a phone that's not supported. But for us two, it'll probably be 2 or 3 years maybe.
I mean, I can understand it slightly from the manufacturer's point of view because it cuts down manufacturing costs. The fewer parts you've got, the cheaper devices to make. And obviously, you can do things like sealing a device potentially a lot more effectively without having holes all over the place. And a 3.5mm jack is a big hole to have there. Equally, it's a very robust sort of connection, and it's lasted us, I don't know, is it 100 years or so they've been going?
I don't think the 3.5's been going that long, because the bigger one, the 1/4 inch, has been going about 100 years. But yeah, it's been going for an awfully long time. But, times change. You have to move on with it. Unless you're some sort of Luddite, cha-ching. But let's move on from my terrible joke swiftly and talk about... a very interesting little desktop PC, which is a folding, more or less full-size keyboard and a PC in one. and it looks pretty nice.
And it's stuff full of Intel Atom chips, so how much longer it'll be made is another question we could be asking, perhaps.
Yeah, and it's the Cherry Trail Atom, which...
Oh, they've said they're going to carry on with that one for a little while, aren't they? It's the later ones they're dumping.
Yeah, but it's got pretty ropey Linux support, if I remember correctly. There's some tablets and stuff that are made with these, and it's pretty difficult to get Linux running on them. I mean, well, you can get it running, but just the driver support's a bit ropey, and they don't work very well at all. So I think you'd be all right running Windows 10 on this thing, but maybe you could get Linux running well on it. But it looks pretty cool in terms of form factor. It's sort of the logical conclusion of the compute sticks and that kind of form factor, sticking a keyboard on top of that to make it really quite useful, because all you need is a mouse and a screen at that point. You don't have to lug an extra keyboard, because a mouse is pretty tiny. You can chuck one of those in your bag easily. But keyboards, certainly something that's comfortable to type on, is potentially quite bulky, whereas this you can fold up and stick in your pocket. It looks really nice.
Yeah, I think they've missed a trick by not putting a touchpad on this, because then, as you say, you wouldn't even need the mouse, and it would be everything you want. Clearly, you're going to have some sort of cable. It's got HDMI, so you're sort of limited on how far you can be from the screen if you're thinking about TVs and things, but it does get over that hurdle that we keep on talking about of going to someone's house with, no matter how good your device is, if they don't have a Bluetooth keyboard or something that you can pair with it, it's a bit useless. So this actually gets over that problem.
Yeah, we have talked about this before, because I've expressed, I think, a surprise that the guys behind Raspberry Pi have never come out with anything like this, because it seems the perfect form factor. I mean, a bare board is good for doing projects and what have you, but if it's for education, just have it in a box to start with, so it's protected a little bit, and there's a keyboard there, and you could make them for only $5 or $10 more than they're being made for at the moment, and it just makes so much sense.
Well, there are people making that for the Raspberry Pi, but yeah, an official one would be nice. But I know they've got a lot going on over there. To try and get one of those manufactured would be yet another time sink for them, I think.
I don't know, perhaps just someone of my vintage who is grown up on these 8-bit computers like Commodore 64 and what have you. It's just a very familiar form factor, and it makes so much sense, to be honest, particularly if you can actually interface it directly with a television as opposed to a CRT or an LCD screen.
Well, our next news story is sort of along the same lines of a device which is concealed as another. This is a AA Arduino, or Arduino. So it's basically one of the Arduino, the Tiny 328, which has been sort of shrunk down and reconfigured to be the same size and shape as a standard AA battery. And it's even got the ends on it that a normal battery would have, so that you can plug it into sort of a battery pack, and it'll be powered by the other batteries while sitting in one of the blank battery slots. So it's a clever little thing that you can put all together, but I have to say I've not really come across an Arduino. I mean, I know we talk about Arduinos and everyone knows what they are. I assume they're similar to Raspberry Pis and you know, good for embedded devices and things like this. But I've not actually ever come across one, which seems odd given that we talk about them quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that's partly down to the immensely successful marketing campaign and push that there's been behind the Raspberry Pi, because I think in the real world, a lot of development is actually done on Arduinos as opposed to Pis.
Well, the thing about the Pi is it's more multi-purpose, isn't it? You can go from using the GPIO ports to do really kind of quite low-level stuff, making motors run and that kind of thing, all the way up to running LibreOffice on Ubuntu Mate or indeed Raspbian. So I think that's probably the reason that the Pi has taken off so well, and also the brilliant marketing campaign as well, that, you know, let's not take that away from them. Whereas Arduinos are very kind of specific to one task, aren't they?
Yeah, very much for the hackers and the makers.
Yeah, and one of the things that was holding them back previously, I think, in that space was the lack of availability of access to all the specs and all the code. But that's just changed, hasn't it?
Yes, this is the Arduino 101, and Intel have released the board support package, and so it's got the information about the system on chip module that's within the 101, and that includes CoreOS and the firmware, so you can get into the bootloader and make changes to that. And Arduino has always been sold as a fully open source project, and unfortunately this particular one had some Intel blobs in it, and so this actually gets over that and means that it is now fully open source.
Which is something we can't say about the Pi.
Indeed. Well, we've said that many times, haven't we, about the blobs required to make that run.
Well, let's stick with small devices for a minute. And we've talked about running your phone as a computer quite a lot recently, to be honest. And people with Pis also are in need of screens and keyboards and have had a very fond relationship with the old Atrix stuff. What was that called?
The Atrix dock, I think it was called. It was originally the Motorola Atrix was a phone that you could plug into this dock that was kind of a shell of a laptop with a screen, keyboard, and touchpad. But people realized that it's got fairly standard-ish connectors, and you could therefore plug Raspberry Pis into it. And so their value, which was next to nothing, suddenly shot up as people started buying them up.
Right.
But it's a bit of an ugly hack. You've got to have connectors and converters and stuff. And so recently there was the Next Dock, which was pretty much exactly the same, except for standardized connectors with HDMI, full-size HDMI, full-size USB, that sort of thing. And now also you've linked this one called the Superbook, Paddy.
Yeah, and this is from the team that's behind Andromium, which you've got fairly good hopes for, Joe. And this is a very similar dock, but it's going to retail for about $99. It's a 1366 by 768 pixel display. It's got a battery. There's an SDK for developers. So it should actually work with standard Android, but obviously it's be optimized for Andromium. I can see this as a very useful thing to have. You have one at home, you have one at work, and you just carry your phone around as the main device.
Yeah, so just to sort of paint the picture a little bit, it basically is a laptop, and all you do is you plug your phone from the USB into the side of this laptop, and it suddenly has a brain. That's all you're doing is adding the brains behind it. And so it literally must just be a thumping great battery so that it can run for as long as you possibly can have it, and then charge your phone as well. And so it's quite like my Chromebook, actually. Very, very slim, very simple, like I say, the screen and keyboard and whatnot. But it just makes you sort of think, well, of course, I've got all this, like you say, we always say, we've got the power of the computers on your phone in your pocket. Why don't you just plug that in, and it's probably going to be faster than my Chromebook, which is unbelievably slow at times.
One thing that I think sets this apart from the Next Dock, though, is that it says in the kind of advertising blurb for this, support for millions of Android apps as well as Superbook-specific applications. So it seems to be sort of quite tightly integrated with Android, as opposed to being just a dumb shell that is just a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse and a screen that you plug whatever you want into. So it seems like it'll be less versatile, but probably more tweaked and kind of configured specifically for Andromium and Android.
Yeah, it seems to be a bit hard to tell at the moment, doesn't it? Because it's sort of giving you details for early access, and it's just lots of good marketing on the website at the moment. I couldn't find any particular in-depth technical specifications there.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that it will be kind of both, if that's possible. If it can be versatile, so that you can plug an Ubuntu phone or tablet into it, as well as whatever you want, in the same way that the Next Dock was. But yeah, we'll have to see on this one. And I'm also hoping that there's going to be more of this sort of thing, because I'd love to see some genuine choice here, because it seems like an untapped market. People were buying those Atrix docks, as you mentioned, Paddy, and are having to hack things, where it'd be nice if you could have various sizes, various screen resolutions, various build qualities, and various prices to pick the one that suits you. Some people are going to want a nice premium one. Other people are going to want a cheap as chips one. So hopefully we'll see that. And because the Next Dock was pretty successful, even though they did have to extend their Indiegogo or whatever it was by another month. But they hit their target, and they're going to start shipping fairly soon. And hopefully the other manufacturers are going to realize that there's money to be made here. So if we are going to ever get convergence, this is the kind of thing that's going to make it possible, I think.
Yeah, but doesn't it need Android to actually be a convergent operating system as well? I don't see how, if the phone is the brains, how it's going to work without brains that understands it's being plugged into a sensible size screen and things.
Oh, yeah. You do need the correct software to be running on the phone. But I'm hoping for a more general screen and keyboard setup that is just inputs and Bluetooth and stuff that will work with whatever device you want.
Yeah, well, we've already talked about 2 of them on the show already, so they're clearly, just starting to ramp up. And like you mentioned, Paddy, this one's about to be released on a crowdfunding site, so we'll see if it actually makes an impact on there.
Well, my hope of those laptop shells becoming a kind of mass market device all depend on good sales of mobile devices to plug into them. And it's not looking too good, is it, for mobile device sales? Tablet sales are declining for the 6th straight quarter, and even smartphone sales have ceased to grow. They're kind of leveling off now. So why is that? I mean, the tablet thing we've talked about before, but the smartphone sales flattening off, is that just because everyone's got a decent phone now and they're less likely to upgrade it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I can't see a reason that I would upgrade my Moto X because nothing really has come out that is, changing the landscape. And it would have to be something, maybe this isn't the exact example, but something like USB Type-C, where maybe there's a whole load of new devices that come out that just aren't compatible with my phone. The only thing that annoys me is the camera's not so great, but it's good enough. It's not a terrible camera. All cameras on smartphones are pretty good these days. So when you sort of look at the new round of phones, let's say the S7 that's coming out, they're not, head and shoulders above. They've obviously got a better processor and more RAM and higher density of pixels and things like this, but nothing really stands out. So the fact that I've had to pay, upfront for my phone because I'm now on giffgaff, it's a cost that's significant enough that while on a contract you'd get used to a 2-year upgrade cycle, as I'm off contract, I don't think I'm going to make that investment for probably, 3 years since I bought the phone, maybe 4 years, or unless I just, drop it down a toilet or something. So I don't think I'm going to upgrade my phone anywhere near as regularly as I used to, because there's not really much to upgrade it to. Similarly with the tablets, I mean, I've got a Nexus 7, and at no point do I think, if only I had a newer, faster one. The only thing that would be different is potentially the size of the device. Do I want a bigger one or a smaller one? And or will Google continue to support it? I mean, the moment that it doesn't get upgraded to the latest Android release would be the moment that I'd start wondering, do I need to upgrade this?
Oh, you haven't seen my Nexus 9 yet, though, have you? Oh, it's very, very nice.
I'm sure it's very shiny, but is it not a funny sort of size? Because it's a 4x3, isn't it?
Yeah, but that makes browsing the web and reading news and stuff easier, even though watching videos, you get the black bars. But yeah, it feels like a much nicer device. It's got haptic feedback, a word that I know you love, Paddy. And yeah, it's brilliant anyway. But again, that wasn't new, was it? That's a year and a bit old. But it's funny you talked about the contracts there and upgrading phones. If most people are still using that model of free phones and then paying 50 quid plus a month and going for the 18-month or 2-year upgrade cycle, then surely smartphone sales should be as they were, continuing to grow. I don't really understand why. I mean, in our context, in our little kind of bubble of tech enthusiasts who realize that it's better to buy your phone outright, it makes sense. But for the general public who get them all on contract, it doesn't really make much sense to me.
No, I think you've answered your own question because, if you have a pool of 100 people and one by one they buy phones, obviously that's 100% increase in phone sales. But if each of those people are then just renewing their phones, that's then flatlined. There's not going to increase anymore. It's just that everyone's got their phone, and now it's just a slow tick over. And as the article describes, the sales are flatlined.
And this, of course, is the problem in the tech industry, that people don't like nice, steady ticking over of businesses. They like exponential growth, and they like perpetual exponential growth. And nothing actually does that in the real world apart from cancer.
Oh God!
I
feel there's a very subtle analogy there, Paddy.
Perhaps not too subtle, but it's just not tenable in the long term, is it? And we're spending a lot of time talking about earnings this time around, and we could have talked about a lot of the companies as well, like Amazon and Facebook. Both of them have knocked it out of the park. But everybody else is getting hammered because their earnings aren't growing as everyone would like. I mean, Twitter is doing the usual thing of growing a bit, but not sufficiently for people's expectations. And it is an expectations problem, that there is this expectation that you will have perpetual, very strong growth year on, year out. And as we're talking about with phones, it just can't happen in the real world because there are real world constraints there. There are only so many people to buy phones. There are only a certain number of phones any one person might want in their life.
Apart from Joe.
Well, I was going to say, if you met Popey, he's got about 20 phones, all of which run Ubuntu Touch badly.
I mean, since we've been talking about this, I'm just thinking it over. There must be a huge market in, the BRIC countries for growth. I mean, those are massively populous countries, and they are getting to the point, the cost of a phone is coming down, and, in theory, the disposable income per person, we're told, is increasing. So you'd expect those markets to be buying a lot of phones. So I'm a little bit sort of confused, because I would expect that to be boosting the smartphone sales, not of your normal sort of groups like Apple and Samsung, but the smaller ones like Huawei and things like that.
Yeah, I think if you look at the figures, though, Jesse, there is still some growth there. I mean, fairly strong growth in fairness, but it's for minor manufacturers. It's local manufacturers to those countries. I mean, the Chinese, we're used to people like Huawei doing quite well in the West, but there are a lot of smaller manufacturers I've not even heard of, like Vivo, I think it is, isn't it?
Yeah, I hadn't heard of them either. They are Vivo.
Yeah, and Oppo, who you do occasionally see in the West, coming up very strongly behind the big two of Samsung and Apple.
Well, with that list of smartphone manufacturers, there's only two pieces of software behind them. You've either got the Apple ecosystem or the Google ecosystem. And Google recently announced their security report, sort of state of the nation type thing, talking about the potentially harmful apps. And they say that between 2014 and 2015, they say that the number of apps on the Play Store that are potentially harmful has been reduced by 40%. So harmful are things that not only can be malicious, like having bad code and viruses and things, but also unwanted behavior, so collecting users' data or installing spyware and things, so not just viruses. It also says that less than 0.15% of devices running Android installed a bad app that came from the Play Store. And I think part of this is them trying to say, if you stick with the Play Store, you're going to get, good results, and you're not going to get these potentially harmful apps, which are the ones that people, when people moan about their phone not working, it's because they've sideloaded something or got an APK or whatever you. And so I think it's also harking to the fact that Apple often sort of cite how strong and secure their operating system is, and Google are sort of playing catch up, aren't they?
Yeah, Google are basically saying don't use things like F-Droid or the Amazon marketplace and you'll be fine. Just stick to the good old Google Play Store.
Sadly, they've got a point, haven't they?
Well, I think that if you go downloading APKs left, right and centre from any old website, then they've got a point. But I would have thought the Amazon one's all right. And F-Droid, well, I would really, really hope that that's okay, given that it's all open source.
Yeah, but if they're not doing checks on it, Google is scanning all of the apps in the Play Store, and they're checking the code, and they're even scanning people's devices to make sure that they're all running smoothly and there's no malicious code. But does the team behind F-Droid have those sorts of resources, or even have the tools necessary to do all that scanning?
Well, given that they aren't using Google Play services to take complete control of your phone so they can do things like scan it, probably not. And I don't know, I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah, but you're leaving yourself open. I'm not agreeing with the idea of scanning your phone. I see what you're making, what point you're making there. But what I'm saying is that if they're unable to do the scanning on the server side, so where they hold all the apps and before you've downloaded them, if they don't have the tools or the skills to scan it, or they don't know what the latest security vulnerabilities are that they want to scan for, you may well be, with the best intention, downloading a perfectly reasonable app, nothing weird or made by some, odd little sort of bag of people that happen to throw some apps up there, sort of mainstream apps. If they've got security holes, they might not be able to scan for them, and you're going to potentially download something that could be harmful.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying, but at the same time, it locks people into the Google ecosystem and doesn't allow for much competition, does it, when it comes to Android applications? If people are going to just totally stick to the Play Store.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem with that position is that it gets them into this monopoly, and there's potentially going to be antitrust charges brought against Google by the European Commission because of this very fact, in a similar way to Microsoft.
Yeah, a very similar way. I mean, Google are accused of requiring manufacturers to install certain apps and setting various Google services like search and location as the defaults. And as we were talking about a minute ago, the Play Store is hugely important here, I think, because without it, manufacturers can't succeed. I mean, just look at what happened to Amazon, for instance. But if they do use it, they have to take a whole load of other stuff Google wants them to use. And Google keeps rolling additional functionality into Play services, as we talked about on previous shows. And from a user's point of view, that can be a good thing. But clearly, as a manufacturer, it can be a very bad thing because it provides absolute lock-in to your upstream.
Well, that's true. And if you are an Android manufacturer, you've got two choices, haven't you? So either you basically ship AOSP with no Google stuff, or you have all of the Google stuff, including all of the stuff that nobody wants, like Google Play magazines and stuff like that. And that's the issue that the European Commission has here and why Google are potentially going to get into trouble. But as I've said before, when it comes to antitrust stuff, it's quite simple. Don't buy their phones then. You don't have to buy an Android phone. You could buy an iOS phone or even Windows or BlackBerry, or you could buy a phone that's running Cyanogen OS. Although actually that's got all the Google stuff in it. But you could buy a Nexus and Flash Cyanogen mod on there. Okay, the vast majority of people are not going to do that. But I just don't think that punishing a company for being good at being a company is the right thing to do. Because we're not talking about taxpayer-funded stuff here or anything like that. We're talking about consumer choices. Google puts Android out there, offers it to manufacturers on a kind of take-it-or-leave-it basis with all these Android apps, and who cares if there's no one else competing with them? Someone should come along and do a better job of it then. It just seems madness to me that they're going to crack down on this in the same way as the browser stuff in Windows. It's just ridiculous.
There's two aspects to this, isn't there? There's the legal aspect, and legally we have certain antitrust legislation there and anti-monopoly legislation, and it's slightly different from America. And I've heard a lot of American commentators raising eyebrows about this and saying, what the hell is the EU doing? I think they tend to forget that in Europe, Android accounts for about 90% of all devices, and Apple's never claimed to be open, and therefore they can do what they like because they're a very small player, and they haven't got this baggage associated with them where they're making claims that clearly aren't true. But the other side of it, I guess, I'm not sure how to put it, whether it's a moral case, an ethical one, whatever. I mean, you seem happy enough with it because it's something that you're comfortable with at the moment. If you cast your mind back to when BT had a monopoly on phone services in the UK and we all got an atrocious service and paid through the nose for it, you probably weren't very happy about that. If Southern Electric had a monopoly on power supply in the UK, there were no other players in the market, and they jacked the prices up 3, 4, 5 times, you wouldn't be very happy about it. It's only because the monopoly is not having a negative impact on you that you're quite comfortable with it, isn't it?
But it's not a monopoly. I could go and buy an iPhone, which is, as you said, is more lockdown. Why aren't they going after Apple? Fair enough, they don't have anywhere near as much of the market, but they're still locking people into their own services, and you can only buy an iPhone with all of the, I don't even know what gets installed on there, all the Apple stuff there. And why don't they have a problem with that? Because you don't have to buy an iPhone. You don't have to buy an Android phone either. You don't have to buy a phone. You know, that's the elephant in the room here. You basically need to have an electrical supply.
No, you don't.
Well,
you don't need a water supply. You could collect rainwater. I mean, it depends how far down the daft rabbit hole you want to go. I take your basic point. I mean, the bottom line here is there is this legislative framework in place in the European Union. If you don't like it, then fine, campaign against it. It's a bit like paying for the license fee for the BBC in this country. I think those of us on this show aren't particular fans of it, but it exists. Therefore, we have to either pay it or campaign against it, or do both at the same time.
Or dodge it.
Or dodge it, yeah, whatever. It's the legislative framework within the EU. Therefore, I can perfectly understand why the case is being brought. And I think Google are going to cough up over this because they don't want to drag it out. They will lose this case.
All right, so what are we going to get a huge fine, which is going to be pocket change to them. But in terms of real change, we got that ridiculous browser choice thing in Windows. So how are we going to get to a point where manufacturers can release an Android phone that just has Play services and Gmail and Maps, but doesn't have all of the other stuff?
Well, I think that'd be the ideal from the consumer's point of view. I mean, it's very similar to what the supermarkets do if you think about it, and how they have all these secret agreements with their suppliers, with the farmers, which are very bad for the farmers, but you're never allowed to hear about them. It's all behind the scenes. And that's exactly what Google's done here. They've got all these secret agreements, and one of the links I'm going to put in the show notes is to someone who has previously published some of these. In fact, I think he's the only person who's published them, which spell out the agreements that are in place. And they don't seem particularly fair agreements if you're looking at things from a competitive point of view. So if this is all forced out into the open, that's all well and good, I think.
Well, if we do end up in a situation, as I described it there, where you can buy a phone that only has a few useful Google apps and not the useless ones, then I suppose we're probably going to be in a better situation. And fining Google a bit, it never hurt anyone, I don't think. So I suppose you've convinced me. But let's stay with Google and Android and stuff. And rumors abound that the Google Play Store may be coming to Chrome OS, and 1 million Android apps therefore will follow behind that, which means that I will have to take Linux Mint off my Chromebook to check it out if this does happen. But it's still a rumor at this stage, isn't it? It's some code that is in the developer version that someone managed to stumble across very briefly. But that's not to say that it's necessarily definitely going to happen. I think it probably will, but they're kind of hedging their bets on this still, aren't they?
Well, we haven't had the big Google event for the year yet, have we? And I suspect that Swint's going to be all unveiled.
Well, here's hoping that it will be. I don't know. I'm reticent to get too excited about it because I know Google has a history of kind of trying things out and they don't quite ever get beyond that phase of beta. You know, like with Google Glass, for example, you could just about get them, but it never went to mass market. It was still a ridiculous price and stuff like that. So hopefully at Google I/O they will announce this, and then I'll put Chrome OS back on the Chromebook and check it out. But I do have to wonder how useful that is ultimately actually going to be on a non-touchscreen device. Are developers of these apps actually going to start making them more desktop friendly?
No, you're just in there with a little window that looks like a phone, aren't you? And it'll have all the things you need. Well, I picture it being exactly the same as the phone, but just a lot smaller. And you can go from a touch interface to a mouse interface because a mouse is more accurate than your finger. You just can't go the other way round.
I don't know about that. Gestures, it's a different way to interact with things, isn't it? I don't think that it necessarily works. I've tried many times to run Android apps with Chrome extensions. You know, the Arc, is it the Android runtime for Chrome? And you always get that same problem. And with Android x86 as well, it's just not really suited to mouse input. So I think developers would have to make some effort to actually make these applications work well on Chrome OS. And indeed, if it works on Chrome OS, then the chances are it's going to work on any platform that's running Chrome, which is Linux, OS X, and Windows as well. So if this does happen and officially is available, then might it make Android app developers actually push towards perhaps dual interfaces or just an interface that works both ways?
Well, it's more than dual, isn't it? Because if you're making Joe app, you have to make it for a phone, and you assume there's going to be some sort of clever way in which they just squeeze it and stretch it to fit different phone sizes. But then you have to make a different one for a tablet, a different one for a watch. You already have to make a number of different changes to your interface. And if Joe app only has Joe developer, then you're only going to make one, and you're going to spend your entire time ironing out bugs and doing updates and security fixes. But if you've got a whole team, you can then look at moving that onto small watch face interfaces, whether it be the desktop interface, and have it move between the different devices. And it's only going to be big development companies that are able to do that. But I have to say, from my point of view, I'm often frustrated at the fact that I go and open my Chromebook and I think, oh yeah, there's that app that I associate with Google, from my phone or from my tablet. I'll install that. And it's not, you don't have the same selection of applications. And even if, like you say, I get your point about swiping and interface and things like this, even if they are a bit clunky, there's going to be a few apps that are really useful to have on the computer that you can overlook the fact that it's not as elegant as a native sort of desktop application. But, in those small circumstances, it might be really useful to have.
Or perhaps having a small window on the screen will be a boon for you when you're trying to run Tinder at work.
Oh, you've moved off that, haven't you?
All right, let's not go down this route again. Bumble. It's all about Bumble.
What's Bumble?
Oh, this is a rabbit hole. It's like Tinder. Is that the one you were telling me about before, Jesse? Where it's like Tinder, but only the women can contact the men or something.
Yeah, like Tinder, but better.
Tinder Plus.
Anywho, back to the real world. Let's move on away from Google and let's talk about Opera. You always correct me on this.
Oprah Winfrey, yeah.
So Opera, the well-known web browser, has baked in a VPN directly into the browser. And it's only on the development version at the moment, but it basically allows you to change one of the settings to say, yes, allow VPNs. And they've recently acquired a VPN company called SurfEasy, which is clearly the sort of the precursor to doing this. At the moment, there's only 3 servers you can use. There's USA, Canada, and Germany. And I've not used it myself. Have either of you?
Yeah, I span it up this morning to see how it worked. It's obviously a little bit slower, as you'd expect through any VPN service. But I was happily listening to our podcasts via the Google Android Play podcast service, which isn't available in the UK currently, pretending I was in America.
Oh, yeah, I'd forgotten we were on there. Yeah, check us out if you're in America. But there's a bit of a flaw with this VPN service, isn't there? In that it doesn't really protect your identity.
What do you mean? Because it's only encrypting the data from the web browser rather than the full phone?
No, I'm talking about the WebRTC leak issue, which you can get a plugin to prevent. So it's not a massive issue, but it's not the kind of security that people expect. And anonymity, I suppose, is the key word here. But in terms of just doing things like you were doing, Paddy, I think it's absolutely ideal. But I just wouldn't put too much faith in it and I wouldn't rely on it too much. But yeah, just to kind of get around a geo-block or something like that, then it could be quite useful.
Yeah, it was perfectly usable, this. In fact, it's actually quite an attractive browser, and I'm going to leave it installed, proprietary or not, on my Linux box.
Well, it's no different from Chrome, is it, really? I mean, I dismiss it offhand for being proprietary, but I do use Chrome on my phone, and I'm leaning towards starting to use Chrome on the desktop. So why not Opera? It's no worse than Chrome, is it? I mean, it's a smaller company than Google, so it's probably slightly less evil.
That's a funny link you've made. Okay.
Well, speaking of browsers, Firefox 46 was released, and the only thing that I can see is GTK3 support has made it not work with the theme that I had before. So thanks, guys. Although it does mean that my theme was so horribly broken that if people didn't specify a background color of white, which is really lazy web design, and I hate people who do that, then it would just show up as grey and it'd be really hard to read. But now that problem has been solved. So swings and roundabouts, I suppose. But otherwise, not a hugely exciting release, is it?
No, not at all. And to be fair, the only reason we're talking about Mozilla today is about Thunderbird, in fact. And Simon Phipps has produced a paper for Mozilla, sort of laying out the various options open to them for their ongoing attempts to jettison Thunderbird. And he suggested the 2 organisations probably were the best fit to take on the project are the Software Freedom Conservancy and the Document Foundation, which is the German non-profit best known for LibreOffice productivity suite. Now, Software Freedom Conservancy have said they'd be happy to take on Thunderbird. Apparently, the Document Foundation is still considering whether they would or not. I mean, Phipps' report also discussed other groups as potential homes for Thunderbird, including the Apache Software Foundation and the GNOME Foundation. He did point out that the former may be unsuitable because of the funding practices, and the latter had passed on the idea, unfortunately. I thought it was really interesting, though, to see Phipps consider things like technical support structure in his report, which I think will be crucial if Thunderbird's going to have an ongoing future rather than stagnating, which is a distinct possibility as that's what's been happening whilst under the aegis of Mozilla.
Well, to me, the Document Foundation seems the logical choice because they are already hosting a pretty big project. They've got the infrastructure there. They know how to deal with developers and QA and all that kind of stuff. So it just seems like that would make the most sense rather than trying to set something new up. But if they're not interested, I don't know, maybe Conservancy, but I thought they just sued people. They haven't got time for looking after projects, have they, when they're chasing all these ZFS people and whatnot?
Well, we can leave the ZFS stuff for the feedback because we've got some of that there. But from my opinion, I'm not really fussed about what happens to Thunderbird because I don't think I've ever used an email client at home. There's a big caveat there. At work, I live in Outlook, but at home, I just use Gmail or I use it on my phone, and I've never ever installed an email client, so it can go wherever it wants.
Yeah, but that's all well and good. I'm all right, Jack. But what about if you're trying to convert enterprises to using free open source software? You've got a reasonable operating system, Linux. You've got a reasonable Office suite, LibreOffice, and you need to have a reasonable email client as well, because as you said, at work, that's where you use Outlook and Exchange and all that kind of stuff. So I think that beyond the kind of consumer thought of this, just someone who's going to use Gmail, you've got to think a bit more about enterprise and stuff.
For the record, you're the king of I'm all right, Jack. But yeah, I see your point. When it comes to big companies and things, this does need to live somewhere. And of the two, LibreOffice does make sense because in my head, the Microsoft package of tools, Word, Excel, Outlook, come as one. And the idea that you would have a rival, if you want to call it that, or an alternative, which doesn't have an email client, seems like it's missing something. I realize that word processors and spreadsheet applications are sort of productive tools, if you will, whereas an email client is just, a way of storing emails. But in my head, when you get the Office suite, it has an email client in it. So if I were to pick one, it would go with the LibreOffice team.
Yeah, the Document Foundation. That's something that I didn't mention before as well, that if it does go that way, Thunderbird and Firefox seem to be drifting apart in terms of core technologies, with Gecko seemingly going away and new stuff happening with Firefox. So if it were to go to the Document Foundation, they could potentially integrate that within LibreOffice, or at least make it work well with LibreOffice. And as you say, Jesse, produce a full-on Office suite at last that has everything that you need. And something else that you need as part of an Office and in Enterprise is cloud storage. And the gold standard for that in the open source world for the last few years seems to have been OwnCloud.
There's an interesting use of the phrase gold standard, Joe.
Yeah, and we've been a bit down on it, to be fair. But there are people using it, and there's people paying to use it, in fact. But Frank Karlitzek, I think that's how you say it, Karlitzek, something like that, who was the fellow who started OwnCloud in the first place, has left. And he's written a blog post about why he's leaving. And it starts off nice and positive about how well they've done and all this kind of stuff. But then it starts to get a bit vague, really. And he doesn't fully explain what's going on. And I've seen some rumors that he might fork it because he's not happy with the kind of commercial side of things and how that relates to the community.
Yeah, it is very vague. And the statement from the company itself was equally vague, sort of thanking Frank for his work and assuring everyone things will carry on as were. I don't know about the forking side of things, though. I mean, if OneCloud is what it is, I mean, do we really want another one?
Well, it seemed to do all right for LibreOffice, didn't it? But I suppose that was a fairly stagnant project, OpenOffice, whereas this is being actively developed. So it probably wouldn't be a good thing if it were to be forked. But I would like to know exactly what has gone on here and why he has left, because something you don't just leave a project like that, a company that you set up for a project that's doing really well. And I know we like to diss it on this show, but it is very popular. You everywhere, okay, at least within our bubble of Linux and open source and stuff, it is a very, very popular project. So what's gone on here?
Well, obviously we can't answer that directly. Maybe there'll be more news in the future, but I do wonder whether it's popular or the only choice.
Yeah. Well, no, we looked at C-File and Pidio and stuff. There are alternatives, and I would say it is the most popular of the various things that are available.
BoneCloud sort of does the full package, doesn't it? You can have your calendar on there, you can have your contacts on there, not just file sharing and file editing. So it's got a lot more, and it's got all these plugins and things. It's a much fuller package.
Yes, as far away from the do one thing and do it well philosophy as you can get. It's do many things and do them all badly.
All right.
But anyway, should we move on and finish the news with something positive, Jesse?
Yeah, absolutely. So this last story is that GitLab and DigitalOcean have come together in a partnership to allow free, scalable online code testing. So GitLab has GitLab Runner, which allows you to do all this code testing. And now they've released GitLab Runner Autoscale, which basically sits on top of a DigitalOcean droplet and will scale the droplets so that you can get the sort of resources that you require and then scale them back down again. And it's all for free.
Now, that's a bit of an alarm bell to me, because that old phrase of if the service is free, then you're the product. So why is DigitalOcean doing this? Is it just for the PR and the publicity?
God, you're a half glass empty kind of person, aren't you, Joe?
No, I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It sounds like a really useful service for people to use, but I just wonder where the economic benefit for DigitalOcean is, because they are a company after all. They're not a charity.
But you don't need a DigitalOcean account in order to use this. And I guess the idea is that if you become familiar with it, you might then say, oh, actually, these guys, DigitalOcean, have been really helpful and useful. I'll make my own droplet. And that's where they get their money.
So it's just them playing the long game then?
Yeah, I predict that's what it is. And that seems to be the game they're playing. I mean, we have the affiliate link and they don't get any money for like 6 months by the time they've basically paid us and paid for the free droplet for the customer. So they're obviously in a position just to try and make as much growth as possible.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll stop being negative then. It sounds like a very useful tool if you're a developer, and instead of having to use, local machines that are a bit wheezing or whatever, you can use DigitalOcean boxes, which seem to be pretty good. Well, that'll do it for the news then. Let's move on. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporter, Riley Brandt. Now that name rings a bell, doesn't it, Jesse?
Yeah, so quite a few shows ago we did, I did a review of the course that he's made for using open source software to edit photographs. So clearly he's kept listening. So thanks very much, Riley.
Yeah. And of course to our other monthly supporters, very much appreciated. And it occurred to me pretty much as soon as we'd finished recording last time that I didn't thank Ian Barton, and I'm really sorry, Ian. So Ian sent me a Nexus 5 with a smash screen that I replaced the screen on, and there's a bit of a tale there that I won't tell here, but I've now got a working Nexus 5, which allowed us to do the whole piece on Maru and interview Preetam last time. So yeah, very much appreciated, Ian. It's not just sitting in a drawer somewhere. It's actually being used on a regular basis. And I thought I would abuse my position as host of this show to plug a couple of my other shows that I haven't plugged for a while. The Pi Podcast, which is thepiepodcast.com, which, as the name suggests, is about the Raspberry Pi. It's much shorter, much more upbeat than this show. It's usually about 15 minutes of news and then 15, 20-minute interview with someone in the Pi community. So do check that out if you're interested in Raspberry Pis. And also the Joe Rest Podcast, which is my own personal one, which I've resurrected somewhat recently with a new co-host. It's not Linux related in any way at all. It's just talking about random stuff. The last one was about celebrity deaths and music and stuff like that. So that's at joerest.com. So check those both out.
Have you got any podcasts you want to plug, Paddy? No? All right, let's do the contact details.
Okay, yeah, all right. If you want to get in contact with us, show@linuxluddites.com, or on Twitter at Linux Luddites, or there's a Facebook and a Google Plus community, or you can leave a comment on the website.
Okay, so we'll kick off with some feedback on Brave, the browser. Now, oddly enough, we got an email from Roger and some comments on the website from a guy calling himself Luddite Fan, and both of them sent us some comments on Brave and then some comments on ZFS. So I've just split them out. So we'll just do the Brave ones at the top. So Roger wrote, I was a bit surprised by your general stance to the Brave browser in your recent show and wondered if your perception of it might be a bit skewed because nobody likes ads. Maybe consider a similar scenario. What would you think of a browser that automatically removed PayPal donation forms, Flatter links and the like? Spreadshirt or DigitalOcean affiliate links, anyone? And replaced them in a similar manner to the Brave browser, giving percentages to different interests. I realise it doesn't make sense as a real example, but I hope it illustrates the point. I know I'd be really annoyed if this happened to me in a way that I wouldn't be if my PayPal donation link was just blocked.
Well, that would make sense if anyone actually ever visited our website, whereas the reality is they subscribe to the RSS feed and then only ever listen to the audio. But I do take the point, Roger. Yes, that does make sense, that just because we don't like adverts, we're kind of skewed that way. Yeah, it was a good point there.
On a somewhat similar vein, actually, Luddite Fan said, hey guys, I can't believe you defended Brave so much. Well, maybe not defended, but you didn't have a go at them as I anticipated. The advertising companies are hardly the white knights here, are they? But Brave seems like a parasitic company that adds very little to the whole deal. Removing adverts that make the content creators money, only to inject their own ads, seems like extra scummy behaviour to me. So with those two bits of feedback, we seem to be getting, quite a pushback on Brave. There seems, not just from the companies who are saying that it's going to steal all of their revenue, but even the people who would be potential users seem to have quite a strong opinion against it.
Yeah, and something I don't think we've mentioned, and I've not seen other people make any big fuss about, is the fact that the third-party adverts that Brave's going to be serving up is going to be via an advertising company that Brendan Eich is also involved with.
Oh, bit of a conflict of interest there then.
Oh, no conflict at all. It's just money, thank you very much indeed, wherever it comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I would have thought that would have raised up a few eyebrows, but I've not seen anyone flag it up before, so I thought it was just worth mentioning. Moving on to something else slightly contentious then, and that's ZFS. And as Jesse mentioned, Roger and Luddite Fan also had some thoughts on that, so we'll start with Roger. And he said, talking about ZFS, I can't help feeling that resolving it properly is actually really important. If we ignore the license, then what is the meaning of floss? I suppose ignoring the license is the ultimate freedom, but that's not exactly the point. This is about perceptions again. Because it's two pieces of open source software, many people are less worried about it. Essentially, the stance seems to be because they like ZFS and the CDDL, then it's okay to break the license. If this was Microsoft linking the Linux kernel into the Windows kernel to provide the Bash on Windows interface, but without making the Windows kernel GPL, there'd be a huge outcry.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right stance to take. The idea that just because they're two open source licenses, let's just gloss over it and fudge it together, it's fine. I don't think that's right. They quite clearly state that, if you have a GPL'd piece of code and you add some more software to it with a different license, it has to be relicensed all as GPL, but that you can't actually do that with the CDDL. It means that they're not compatible, and I am surprised that Ubuntu has been released with ZFS support, if I'm honest.
I wonder if it ties into the fact that very few projects on GitHub these days even bother with a license, and that people are just sort of sick of the whole complication of open source licenses. And it's like, well, either you've got source code available or you haven't. Why do we need to get bogged down in all this licensing stuff?
Well, it's maybe Roger's slightly tongue-in-cheek point about ignoring the license as the ultimate freedom, which I thought was quite a nice line.
If you had a license that didn't restrict your freedom, you wouldn't need to ignore it in the first place, would you?
Not just me trolling this episode, I see. So Luddite Fan said, I enjoyed Paddy's comments about Linux/ZFS/Canonical and the FSF/Software Conservancy. I hadn't considered the social angle. If the Software Conservancy were to fight Canonical and win, then ultimately the FSF and Software Conservancy would lose developer mindshare because nobody outside the FSF really considers what Ubuntu is shipping to be a particularly bad thing. All this for ZFS too, which will probably turn out to require too much faffing and not be worth it anyway. Which is a good point. I've briefly tried out ZFS and I just thought it's just not worth it for what I need it for.
Yeah, I think that's my point of view as well. I'm not really that fussed if it's ext3 or ext4 underneath or ZFS or anything else. All I really see is the stuff on top. However, I know the benefits of ZFS. I know, from a server point of view or from a sort of mainframe point of view, it's got some really powerful features. And it would be nice if it was in Linux. I think it would mean that a lot more people would use Linux. But I still can't get over the fact that you essentially can't do it, as I was saying before about the licenses.
Well, that's not what Canonical thinks, but hopefully we'll find out one way or another fairly soon, because I'm already getting a bit bored of this, to be honest.
Well, let's change the subject then and talk about SyncThing, as we did last show. Dennis said, "You complained about SyncThing's awkwardness, but think about what you're doing. You're allowing devices that are located anywhere in the world to constantly communicate and remain synchronized. I must fall into the patient category, as it seemed to work quickly enough for me. Another thing that I like is that even though it still feels like early days, the development is really active, and on different devices inside multiple networks, it always seems very smooth and powerful."
I sort of have two stances on this. Part of me thinks, yeah, you're right, it is doing quite a lot of work on the back end, and it is, one of the better versions of that sort of software, and we had some nitpicky things to say about it, but overall it did work fairly well. But then on the other side, you could say, look at what I'm doing. I'm talking to this microphone. I've got earphones and the lights and the monitor, and it all comes together and it works. But you expect it all to work. We've come to a point now that technology is where it is. You have to have some expectation, and synchronizing mobile devices is one of those expectations. So while I understand his point that it's impressive, and of course it is impressive, the very fact that you've got a phone in your pocket is also impressive.
Yeah, we might return to that idea when we talk about Ubuntu in a bit. But let's talk about WhatsApp. And Will said, "It's nice that WhatsApp are providing secure messaging to such a large population, but WhatsApp is not really comparable to GPG encrypted email. WhatsApp is a centralized proprietary service with all users communicating with its servers. Email is a standardized protocol with many different implementations. For encrypted email to become widely used, the relevant parties would need to agree to add it to the standard, and the problem of key exchange would need to be addressed. WhatsApp can change its protocol without anyone else's approval and can host all users' public keys on its servers. GPG tries to bolt encryption onto the side of the current email protocol, and that works okay if both parties take the time to set it up, but it's unlikely to see wide adoption on its own."
I think those are fair points. I quite often see people talking about email as this distributed system, though, and although technically that's right, it's just never gelled well for me, because actually running an email server is a lot more work than you think it should be.
Yes, but you can always pay someone to do it. I mean, that's the whole open source argument, isn't it? That I couldn't look at the source code of anything and make head or tail of it. It's just gibberish. But I can always pay someone to do that. And similarly, I could pay someone to set up an email server for me. And so I would have total control of that. And even if I fired that person, the next person that came along who I paid would have equal control over it, wouldn't it? Because it's all open standards. Whereas something like WhatsApp, you've just got no control. You're just totally trusting one company.
I thought Monopoly was good.
I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying that, okay, yeah, you've got me, whatever.
But I mean, in Will's point, he accepts that GPG isn't easy and it is difficult to get working. And so this is the whole point I think that we're trying to make, was that WhatsApp have, at least, while it may not be the perfect implementation, it is the best you're going to get with WhatsApp and, most of these services. I mean, I'm just thinking about my phone, for example. I've got WhatsApp, I've got Telegram, I've got Hangouts, and I have SMS. I don't get any SMSs. I mean, there's the Google Messenger, whatever it's called, and nothing goes in there apart from text from the delivery company and things like this, because everyone else is using non-standard protocols, and you have to have the specific application. So, okay, it's not perfect, but I think they've done the best they're going to do. They've been as open about it as they can, and I don't think you're going to be able to do it without someone's server. So it's just going to have to be done this way or not done at all. But John O'Brien also got in touch on this topic and said, related to your conversation about WhatsApp, I was recently looking for an alternative messaging app through F-Droid and found an app called Libre Signal, and he links us to the F-Droid page. I'm curious how Libre Signal compares to both Signal and WhatsApp and really enjoy hearing the Linux Luddites comparison and review. Your recent segment where you discussed just how much of WhatsApp is open and auditable versus closed made me wonder. However, Libre Signal appears in very early development, so it may not be fair to do a review just yet, perhaps further down the road. I did have a look at this, and I mean there are warning signs on the wiki page about this is very early, this is alpha, boom. So I think it would be a little bit unfair, but at least it's good to see that there are alternatives using Signal that are open source, which is important to have on F-Droid.
Yeah, it certainly looks like one to watch, and either we'll keep an eye on it, or if it gets to a point where it's out of alpha and a decent beta, then do let us know, John, and we'll check it out. But that'll do it for the feedback then. Let's talk about Ubuntu. As Jesse mentioned at the very top of the show, you can't have failed to notice that Ubuntu 16.04 has been released, the long-term support version, which is usually a fairly big deal. But I seem to be hearing fairly negative things about it on my travels around the internet. And I don't think it's really worth us digging too deeply into a review of it or any of the particular flavors. But I think it is worth noting its release and talking about where Ubuntu is as a project, where the community is with the various flavors, and I suppose examining why it isn't particularly exciting, really. So I suppose the obvious place to start here is the main Unity version of it, which I presume we've all installed just to check it out. And here we are, a full LTS cycle after we were originally supposed to be getting Unity 8 and Mir, and we still haven't got it. Which I suppose the ethos of this show suggests that we should be happy about that. But I know that there are a lot of people who want to see innovation and progression happen. And it seems that the last, I can't remember how many, basically since Unity came along, the first couple were a bit ropey, but then it got fairly stable and it's a case of like it or don't like it. But it hasn't really changed much, has it? It hasn't developed much. And so you see people desperately trying to do reviews of it, but there's nothing to really talk about. So the first question, I suppose, is that a good thing?
I suppose it's kind of difficult to give a general appearance without hitting some actual, key milestones or just sort of the sort of highlights, if you will. For me, one of the things that is better is the fact that they removed the Ubuntu Software Center and replaced it with GNOME software and just called it Ubuntu software. It's a lot quicker, it's a lot easier to use, it's better looking, but that does admit to me that they had given up on the Ubuntu Software Center, and rather than doubling down and making it better and writing some better code, they just deleted it and installed something else. It doesn't look like it just shows how little they're focusing on the desktop to me.
And it's something that's pretty non-functional at the moment as well.
What, the GNOME Software Center or the Ubuntu, whatever they're calling it now? Yeah,
whatever it's called. I've seen over the last few days various patches being rolled out so that you can actually install snaps and things from it, which you couldn't originally. But the amount of software that's actually missing from it, I mean, the very first thing I do when I install my PC, you might think it's to install Chrome, and it isn't. The very first thing I do is to install KeePassX, because that's got all my passwords in for everything. So I've got no idea what my passwords are for any of these services. And KeePassX, although it's a GUI application, isn't in the new Software Center.
But presumably it's in the repos then, so you can just apt-get install it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an issue for me as a sort of practice Linux user, if you like. But it's one of those things. There are quite a few apps that I would expect to be in there that are clearly missing. I mean, an awful lot of CLI stuff isn't there, but there are some other GUI apps that aren't as well. And I don't understand how that's happened. I know when we talked about the Software Center, the GNOME one in the past, it was all down to the metadata and whether there were proper descriptions there for these packages, whether they'd be included or not. But somehow I just expected in Ubuntu that everything would be there you got in Synaptic, and it certainly isn't.
Well, you talked about snaps in there, and I didn't even realize that you would be able to do it that way. So I just did it via the command line.
Well, you couldn't do it that way initially. Say that's been rolled out in the last day or so, as far as I can tell. And the other thing that struck me as really strange about it is it's got all these nice review facilities so that you can leave feedback and give stars and things to bits of software that you download, which is a very modern sort of approach. But you need an Ubuntu One account to actually do that, and it appears you need an Ubuntu One account to download and install snaps via the software center as well.
Whoa. I thought the Ubuntu One wasn't a thing anymore.
Oh, no, it's been there as an account that lets you buy applications and stuff, but it was just the cloud storage bit that they turned off, which was confusingly also called Ubuntu One.
Yeah, and I seem to recall when we were looking at the phone software, you also need an Ubuntu One account to be able to install updates and such like. So I wonder if that's all sort of tied in behind the scenes, and that's why it's appearing on the desktop.
Yeah, I would have thought so. So we talked about how they're not focusing on the desktop, and if you look both ends of things, that they clearly are not doing that. They're concentrating either on the phone stuff. You've got one team doing the Ubuntu Touch and the snappy stuff, and then another team who's really working hard on the server stuff, which is why we've got things like ZFS. And Shuttleworth's always going on about OpenStack and that kind of thing. And they had the Linux container stuff in there, LexD and LexC and that kind of stuff. And they seem to be leaving the desktop behind. And so it's not really a surprise that you're ending up with quite a lot of flavors appearing. I mean, we've talked a lot about Ubuntu Mate on this show, Ubuntu Martin, because he's such a good publicist, and fair play to him. And that seems to be really popular, as does Ubuntu GNOME as well. I think that's pretty popular. And now you've even got Ubuntu Budgie Remix. And of course, all the other ones, Ubuntu's Ubuntu. And for a company who seemingly doesn't care that much about the community, you've got a lot of community flavors that are using at least some of the resources of that company. And there's even talk of the Budgie version trying to gain official status like Ubuntu Mate has. And so I thought that Canonical were moving away from community, but if they do accept another official flavor, then I don't know, maybe I was wrong about that.
Something we talked about a long time ago, I seem to remember, is the fact they might eventually move to a community-only model for the desktop, because the desktop doesn't make them any money at the end of the day, as far as any of us can tell from the lack of financials we get from them. Its server side is the stuff that's really important to them. And we'd posited previously that they might just abandon things altogether and just say, go get it to the community.
But what would happen in terms of the build infrastructure and the hosting and stuff? Do you think that would just be left to the community to finance themselves, or would they continue to support it, do you think?
I'd have thought they'd continue to support it. I mean, the slight hole in this particular theory, of course, is the actual main Ubuntu distro that you were talking about a minute ago, and the idea of convergence, because how does that work across your desktop on your PC and your phone if you're giving away any control over the desktop? So I'm not really sure whether it's going to happen or not, but it's certainly one way they could go, and potentially is a reason why they're more than happy to see all these additional flavors come on board.
That could be kind of a long-term plan there, because you have to wonder how much it actually costs them, you know, in terms of real hard cash, to allow the flavors to use the build servers and all the bandwidth and the associated costs there. I would have thought that relative to the actual developer hours that go into making the distro, the desktop, all of the server stuff is probably a lot more in terms of their outgoings.
Yeah, I'd agree with that assessment. I think it's probably, you've already got all the hardware. You say you've got the cost of bandwidth and things, but mostly it's just going to be churning away in the background on hardware that probably doesn't do anything but churn through when releases are there. But you've sort of spoken about the flavors as if they're a forward planning thing. I think the flavors are a legacy that they've got lumped with, and now they can't really get rid of them. I mean, you would be torn apart by the wider Linux community if they said, we're only releasing Ubuntu and all you flavors can go and, take a hike. which is probably what they would prefer, because then they could just double down on unity and convergence and keep it all in that little bubble. But because they had them before and because they've had them for ages, they sort of have to stick with them, and maybe a little bit reluctantly so.
But why are they continuing to take new ones on then? Ubuntu Mate was the last one, and it's looking potentially like the Budgie one might become official as well. Is it because they can't turn down people, otherwise they look bad? They kind of don't want to be seen to be turning their back on the community. So if a flavor comes along and it meets all the technical requirements and everything, then they have basically no choice but to let them become official.
Yeah, again, through the legacy of something having a remix tag, then it becoming good enough or big enough support by the community to then be brought up to the official status. And, you didn't actually mention KDE, but Kubuntu is in a bit of a questionable position at the moment, isn't it? Because Jonathan Riddle left and is now working on KDE Neon, and it's whether or not Kubuntu is going to be viable in the future. If we just shift a little bit towards where Ubuntu is with convergence, I know that the Ubuntu M10 tablet has been released, and you've had a look at it, haven't you? And you haven't actually told us what you thought of it. So can you tell us what it was like?
Yeah, so at the Egham Raspberry Jam about a week ago, I met up with Martin Wimpress, speaking of Ubuntu Mate, and he has bought one. He's bought the fancy one, the full HD one that's slightly higher spec processor and everything. And I was really excited to see it in desktop mode and everything, and we had a Bluetooth mouse and keyboard and everything. And it was terrible. It was just absolutely terrible. Now, I'm known for my negativity, so you'd expect me to say that. So let me back up and qualify it a little bit. Okay, so this thing did window quite well, and you had LibreOffice that was running fine, and the Xmere stuff was working reasonably well, but the actual experience in tablet mode was terrible. You do that gesture where you swipe in from the right, and it was all juddery, and it was just really, really terrible. Now, Popey defended this by saying that, that was OTA 9, but OTA 10 fixes it. And that's a reasonable defense, and okay, fair enough. But let's step back from this. If this was a ROM for the Nexus 7, then I would forgive it, the issues that it has, and I would be quite impressed with it. Wow, this thing can run X applications, and it can also be a tablet, and I'd think, yeah, technically that's pretty good. But we're not talking about just a ROM for the Nexus 7 that tinkerers are going to install. We're talking about a consumer piece of hardware that you can buy, and nowhere does it say this is for developers. Nowhere does it say this is not production ready. And so I think that Canonical should be embarrassed about this tablet, really. I think that shipping a product in the consumer space like this that is, quite frankly, terrible in terms of the user experience is embarrassing. I think it's embarrassing to Canonical and Ubuntu. I think it's embarrassing to Linux in general. And I also think it's embarrassing to the wider FOSS community. And you can be positive if you like about this and see the positive sides of things. And a lot of people are doing that, and I can see those positive sides. But I think that, how does it look when friends of mine who are into technology link me to an article announcing this thing and say, oh, well, this looks interesting, I might get one. And I have to say to them, no, don't. It's terrible. Or do I let them buy it and then they check it out and go, what did I buy? Send it back. And then Ubuntu, oh, that Linux stuff, that's rubbish. Do you know what I mean? It tarnishes, to me, the reputation of FOSS. I don't, maybe I'm going overboard with this and reacting too heavily, but Ubuntu has always been, for me, the flagship distro, the one that is easiest to use. And it all started going downhill when Unity came along. But even now, you could probably install Unity for someone who didn't know that much about computers, and they would get on with it. And it wouldn't leave a sour taste in their mouth. Whereas put someone in front of this tablet, and I'm telling you, they would never want to use Linux again.
What's the Ubuntu tagline? Computers for human beings?
Yeah, Linux for human beings. Well, no, this is a tablet for developers. People like Martin, who wants to try and hack through Xmere to get Ubuntu Mate running on it. or at least Mate, and he wants to mess around with it and develop with it, which is fair enough. If they'd marketed it that way, then I wouldn't have just given that huge speech there. I would have said, okay, it's a development, work in progress, piece of hardware for enthusiasts, and I'd be really positive about it because some of the technical challenges that they have overcome are really, really good. But it's like I was really positive about Maru because that is a ROM for a phone, and it doesn't, they're not selling that in a shop as this new amazing thing. It's clearly a work in progress. It works quite well as it happens right now, but there are some very rough edges on it. And that's exactly where we are with Ubuntu. There are some very, very rough edges, and yet it's being sold to the general public as a consumer device. And we've got this other Meizu phone that's coming out, the Pro 5, I think it's called. And I don't suppose that's going to be much better than this M10 tablet. And again, it's just an embarrassment.
Would it be fair to say that some of what what we're all hearing is from the fact that we've just opened up this discussion with they've not been concentrating on the desktop, and yet what they have been concentrating on also isn't delivering?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I mean, look at Plasma Mobile. That is a side project, effectively, from the whole KDE Plasma Desktop and all the KDE applications. So you don't expect it to be super duper first class experience. Whereas it feels almost now that the desktop in Ubuntu is the side project, and yet their main thing, or at least their main consumer facing thing, isn't delivering. It seems that it is delivering on the server side of things, and that is what's keeping them going. But in terms of the consumer facing side of Ubuntu, it just does not look good to me at all.
Okay, I'm slightly regretting asking Joe what his view of the M10 was now, but that's clear for everyone to see.
Got that out of my system.
Okay. So, I mean, going back to the desktop, there are some key pointers that we should maybe highlight. Things like it's on the 4.4 LTS kernel, it's on System D, they've got the GNOME calendar integrated. As I said, they've removed the Ubuntu Software Center, but one of the other things that they've removed is the online search. Now, you can turn it back on, and I think a lot of people have an issue with the idea that when you type in the dash, all your information is going through the Ubuntu servers and going off to Amazon, and then it comes back with all these responses. And I think people had a big problem with the fact that there was no choice in the fact that your information was going out to these remote servers. But actually, just from a user experience, it was so cluttered and so much noise and things that I had no interest in looking at all. There's no way I'm going to type text in order to find a text editor and want to see like a jumper made by Textiles something or other. It was just really, really annoying from a user perspective. So the fact that that's been turned off by default, I think, is a big improvement.
Yeah, I was going to mention that actually. That is the one very, very positive thing. At last, they've done that. Let's not worry too much that it's taken them this long to do it. Let's be positive and say, okay, hopefully going forward, it's going to be off. It's an option there for people who want it, but by default, it's off. So at last, hats off to them for that.
Yeah, they've also apparently showed some love towards the USB Startup Creator, which annoyingly only allows you to make Ubuntu-based startup USB pens, which is quite annoying for me, so I never really do. I just DD everything. And they have dropped Brazero and Empathy, so it just sort of shows you the times that people aren't really making DVDs anymore, so they're not even bundling it. So there are a few other changes they've made. You can move the sidebar to the bottom if you dig deep enough.
That was the Chinese guys, wasn't it, who came up with this cunning wheeze?
Yeah, so Ubuntu Kylin, I think they wanted it to be on the bottom because that's how their users expect it to be. And so they've spent the time hacking it, and Ubuntu just took that hack and allowed it to be used on standard Unity. But I think that for me, one of the big changes is the addition of snaps. I am going to point out, I'm pretty sure this was one of my predictions as well. So I'm relieved that at least one of them's come true.
Oh, one of your really stellar, really difficult predictions. Yeah, that was really unlikely to happen.
Well, you've got to predict something. So you can now install snaps on this version 1604. I guess you guys have tried it?
Yeah, I installed some via the command line. I had to work out how to do it with tab completion, but got some things working. I was playing Moon Buggy, I think it's called, which is a very simple sort of ASCII game where you have to jump over some craters, I think you'd call it, which was a 64 megabyte download. When it was a game and it was 64 megabytes, I was expecting, a graphical game here, not some terminal-based ASCII game. So I thought that was a bit strange. And one of the other ones that was available was Calculator. So I installed that. 120 megabytes for a calculator. And it worked. It was a nice-looking scientific calculator. But I thought, how big would a normal calculator be? Okay, Calculator with a G. 159 kilobytes. Yeah, that seems more like it to me.
Wow, I'm glad you made that comparison, because I know that with the Snap, I expect people are familiar, but a Snap basically packages all the libraries and everything that you would need for that to run in a self-contained Snap, as they're called. And so it gets rid of all this dependencies problem. And it also means that you can install software that isn't in the repos, so you can, sort of keep it up to date if there's new software that comes out and you want to use it. But I knew that it packed everything into this one binary. I didn't realize that it was that much bigger. And I always sort of was a bit blasé about the thought, because the whole point of having shared libraries and things is that you reduce the number of things you have to download, because way back in the day we didn't have broadband and that was a problem. But now that everyone's got broadband and you just say, yes, update, yes, install, I don't anyway, concentrate on the size of things. I hadn't realized it was that much of a difference. That sounds like a huge difference.
That sounds like a ridiculous difference, to be honest. I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of talking about producing efficient code sort of during a review of Ubuntu, but that's like a whole Linux distribution plus your calculator on top, isn't it? That's Puppy Linux or whatever.
Yeah.
It could be running there. So it's very poorly put together. And if they are sucking in the dependencies, they're including the whole libraries as opposed to just the bits they need and all the rest of it. I mean, that's just shoddy coding, shoddy packaging.
I mean, undoing what I've just said about the fact that we all have broadband, Snaps are made so that they run on the phone as well. And that doesn't have broadband. That's going to be on your data plan if you want to install something new.
Yeah, if you're not connected to Wi-Fi. And it makes you wonder how the updates are going to work long term for this. Are they going to be proper deltas, or are you going to be replacing the whole package every time?
Well, they've said that it's going to be deltas, so it's only the small bits of code that change. So once you've downloaded it and installed it the first time, the updates will be very small. So that's a positive for the Snaps. And also, like I said, it does mean that Ubuntu, this long-term support version, which from various things I've read is like one of the most installed versions. So people don't really do the interims. They mostly stay on the long-term supports. And you get really bogged down with how old the software is. So being able to install new software whilst keeping the LTS base, I think is a really massive selling point.
Well, sticking with some of the changed software then, I mean, we talked briefly about ZFS earlier, and it is there. It's not easily accessible, is it?
Well, I didn't get round to checking out the server version, which I presume it's more front and center there, but on the desktop version, it's very much not there. If you don't know to look for it, then it's basically not there.
Yeah, at this stage of the game, you have to install a load of command line tools and set things up that way yourself. It's certainly not accessible in the Ubiquity installer or anything like that at the moment.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the flavors. So the flavors that I am mostly interested in are Ubuntu, Ubuntu, Ubuntu Mate, and the new one, which isn't official, that we mentioned, Budgie, which is the desktop from Solus. But let's briefly talk about Ubuntu. Nothing's changed as far as I can see. There's no LXQt. It's just exactly as was, which for me is a good thing because it's good old reliable Ubuntu, which means that I've got another 3 years that I can rely on that for low-end hardware, people who finally move away from XP, that sort of thing. I'm sure a lot of people are disappointed that there's no LXQt going on there by default, but I'm very happy. Ubuntu Mate we'll get back to, but Ubuntu, that's what I'm using right now and what you use as well, Paddy. You have presumably checked this out as I have. I can't see much difference. It looks a little bit Well, they changed things just for the sake of it. It's got the newer version of XFCE, 4.12, I think it is. And apart from that, it just seems to be more of the same, which is, again, a good thing.
Well, it would be if they didn't have to put so much effort into getting there. That's the thing that's really struck me looking at all of these different flavours. It's almost like, a very dystopian local council where they hire one lot of guys to go out and dig a hole in the road and then a lot to go out and fill it in again. And there's so much work gone into these behind the scenes just to stand still. And that's what really struck me, because nothing has changed much across the piece. Bugs that were there, that have been there for many years, I can still see as being there. No great improvement. Everything's got new wallpapers, terrific. Everything's obviously got up-to-date packages. But that's all they seem to spend the time doing, is repackaging things and rebuilding. And I don't know whether it's just a symptom of how we build software and put things together in this Linux world that we live in, and whether snaps will finally get us out of that. But it seems to be a hell of a lot of work for very little sort of end result.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think the end result is something that I'm quite happy with. So I don't want huge changes. I just want stability. And if that means a lot of work for developers, then, as Jesse alluded to earlier, I'm all right, Jack. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, Ubuntu Mate. We have to talk about that, don't we? Otherwise, Martin will be really disappointed. So again, once you're actually using Ubuntu Mate, it's not very different from Ubuntu was pre-Unity, except for the kind of little tweaks that he's put in here and there. We talked about client-side decorations and stuff like that. So it seems to be all good stuff. But the star of the show is Ubuntu Mate Welcome, I think it's called. Its full title just generally gets called Welcome. And the software boutique within that. Now, the software boutique is all well and good. You can access that via the menu afterwards. But it doesn't matter how good Welcome is to me. The overwhelming majority of people are going to close it as soon as they see it, because we are trained to close pop-ups, aren't we? Through the web, and generally speaking, it's, if anything pops up, it's either a EULA or an advert or just something you want to get rid of and get on with it. And so I'd wish I could suggest a better way of doing things. And yes, you can get access to Welcome again via the menu, but I think that it's an awful lot of effort has gone into it, and it is a really good piece of software. But I just worry that not many people are going to actually see it.
I'd have to disagree. I think that when you do install a new distribution and your eyes are open, you're going to be saying, okay, this is new, this is different, and you're going to take notice of it. It doesn't pop up out of nowhere. It's there as the startup, and Mint has it, and Ubuntu has one. It's sort of it's almost by the very fact that multiple distros have it as a hello, and here's how you do these things in this distribution, or let me hold your hand for this first moment. I think people are more used to it than you give them credit for, and will be less dismissive than they would be than if they were browsing the web and a pop-up appeared.
I really, really hope so, because it is good. Once you actually use it, it's good. But my instinct, like I fear most people's, is to close it. So I really hope I'm wrong, and I really hope you're right.
What specifically is one of the benefits of it?
Well, the software boutique is something that Martin talked about when we first interviewed him, I think, about the idea of, instead of a graphical package manager, software center, whatever you want to call it, that gives you everything and has everything available, it just gives you a hand-picked selection of, these are the best couple of things that do that particular job that you want to do. And I do quite like the way he's done that. It gives the distro value, because you are basically putting your trust in the team creating that distro to pick certain bits of software that they recommend.
Is this what Ubuntu have done with the software center? I know we were talking earlier about the fact that there's less software than you'd expect, Paddy. Has it been curated, or do you think it's just lacking?
Oh, it's just lacking.
Okay, so we're happy with the idea of having a curated software center where it just has the one messaging app or the one webcam app or whatever it may be. But it sounds like Ubuntu have gone halfway and have just missed things out.
Yeah, and in Welcome generally, it's very useful. The documentation in there is good, and doing updates and all that kind of good stuff. It really does what you would hope a distro would do when you first install it. And it has been in development for quite some time, and there's been a lot of people contributing to it. And so I'm not surprised that it has become very refined and is the kind of star of the show in this particular release. Because installing software is just a one-click affair, and it's not just stuff that's in the repo either. It's stuff like Chrome is one click to add the relevant repos and all that stuff, and stuff like Steam, which I'm sure there are a lot of people who download the OGG of this show who think that's a bad thing. But I'm sure there are a lot more, well, I know there are a lot more MP3 listeners who are probably more pragmatic and think, well, I actually do want to install Steam. I do want to install Skype. I do want to install Flash for those few websites that I need it for. I do want Chrome. And so from a purely pragmatic point of view, it does that really, really well and seamlessly, rather than having to open a terminal and add PPAs and that kind of thing. It just does it all behind the scenes and seems to me, at least in my testing, to work pretty well, perfectly.
You used the phrase elephant in the room earlier, Joe, and I'm therefore loath to do so again, but I think we're probably missing a very important factor here. And we're talking about Ubuntu on the desktop in its various different flavors. We also recently spoke about Ubuntu on Windows. And I don't really want to get into it now, but do you not think that's going to have a potentially major impact on the ecosystem here as well?
I think it'll have less impact than the Linux community likes to think it will, to be perfectly honest. I think that there will be a number of developers who will use it in Windows, and it will potentially drive some people who've been wanting to try out Linux to do so on their nice, comfortable Windows 10 environment. But I can't see people who develop full-time in Linux suddenly going to Windows just because they've got the Ubuntu command line there now. Because as good as that is ever going to be, it's never going to be as good as proper Linux, is it? As a proper bare metal Linux install. But to wrap this whole thing up then, let's just examine. We've just spent an awfully long time talking about Ubuntu here. And we've talked about all the different flavors. And the question is, why have we done that? And that is because it doesn't really matter what decisions Canonical is making. It doesn't matter what the default desktop environment is. It doesn't matter whether they've been diverting resources elsewhere. The fact remains that the underlying distro that we've got here is still good, is still solid, and I am very happy with it. I'd prefer to stick an XFCE desktop on top of it, or Mate, or whatever, but it is still a valuable project, I think. It is still more or less the flagship that we have as a Linux community. And I think that it's very easy to get bogged down and forget that. But when it comes to actual computing, be that on the desktop or the server, Ubuntu is still solid for me. And I'm going to continue to use it, I think, throughout the life of this 1604 LTS.
Yeah, it is still going to be the distro that you recommend to people. Of course it is. And that must be the highest praise you can give to a distro.
Yep. And with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or at the Google Plus and Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again in 2 weeks with more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye, everybody.
See you later.